Hello, everyone. I'm here with the amazing Professor Nicholas Christakis. This conversation has been a while in the making, but his efforts in perhaps the way I saw it during the pandemic, unfolding information throughout social media, Twitter especially, were very amazing. And I imagine that your work in the laboratory, in the Human Nature Lab in Yale, also did a great work on during the pandemic. So thank you for joining me, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure finally to make your acquaintance, face to face through Zoom.
I have so many questions for you. When I contacted you first was for your book Blueprint, which was a mind-blowing book. I cried, I laughed, and then I have to tell you in which parts of the book I laughed and I cried as well. But
Oh, that's so kind of you to say because that book was 10 years in the making. And I am proud of that book. It was a labor of love, and it tries to capture a set of scientific discoveries that I think are quirky, but fundamental and important. But it also tries to advance a scientifically well-grounded, but philosophically appealing claim, right? Which is that humans are good, that we evolved to have good societies and to manifest properties like love and friendship and cooperation and teaching, which are so wonderful. And anyway, so it fits in with my own. It's a scientific effort that fits in with my own personal biases. So I'm glad to hear you liked it.
yeah, I absolutely loved it, and I think this past year has been a stress test to what you call the social suite, and I do believe that it passed the test. I would love to get your thoughts on how this pandemic actually tested our hierarchies, our institutions, our social interactions as a whole. Speaking with people 24/7 via Zoom must have an impact in the way we interact with one another. And Apollo's Arrow tries to unfold, the history of the pandemic, what has been happening, and from a historical perspective, because at least for me, this is the first time I witnessed such a crisis, but your book puts a great perspective on it. So I would love to dive deep first into Apollo's Arrow and your main insights into how has the pandemic unfolded up until today, and what are some of the biggest insights you've had during this whole situation that we're living?
I guess what I would say is, maybe I'll start by saying why I even wrote the book. I mean, usually your listeners don't know me. I'm a hospice doctor. I used to be a hospice doctor. I take care of people who are dying, and I run a laboratory. I do scientific research on a host of topics, from artificial intelligence to the microbiome, to human social networks, to global public health, to epidemics, to all kinds of topics we study in the lab. And then every 10 years or so, I also write a book, and I had written Blueprint, which was published in 2019. And I had in mind the next book to write, which I figured would take 10 years. So that would be 2029 or something. And then the pandemic struck. And what happened with the pandemic was that I had a longstanding collaboration with some Chinese scientists, and we had been using phone data from China to study human social interactions, which is one of my interests. Like, how do people form face-to-face networks? How do those networks affect their destiny? How do they affect their lives? And we had been using these data to study things about, for example, when an earthquake struck in China, who did people call first? Could you get a clue as to who people cared about? Like, honey, I'm in a collapsed building, I'm calling you, kind of thing. And we realized we could use these data to study the epidemic. And because we had data on the movement of millions of people through Wuhan in January of 2020. And we published a paper in April of 2020, which showed that we could use the movement of people through Wuhan as traced by their phone data, which translocated from Wuhan, let's say, to another part of China. We could use that human mobility data to perfectly predict the timing, intensity, and location of the virus, the epidemic, throughout the rest of China through the end of February. And as a result of this work, I was really paying attention to what was happening in China with the epidemic in the early days, and became aware of the fact that as January 24th, the Chinese government promulgated rules that required 930 million people to be at home. And so that really got my attention. At that time, at the early day of the epidemic, the Chinese saw in the virus a threat of sufficient magnitude that they basically detonated a social nuclear weapon. They were like, okay, we're going to stop this. And then I looked at what was happening in the United States, and our previous president was saying, never, don't worry. And the American and the public discourse in the United States was really not taking this seriously. And all of my epidemiologist friends were very worried we were going to have a global pandemic. And then when Italy collapsed in February, I was like, there's a rich Western democracy that brought low by the virus. It's clearly going to come here. It's going to cause great havoc in our society and around the world. And still in February, people weren't concerned. And then I sort of thought, well, maybe I should write about this. Maybe I should write a book about this and do other things like the Twitter threads. And actually my lab, I redirected my lab to do all kinds of research. We did projects on gathering bans. We did projects on the tracing of people through China. We did projects on COVID testing. We released an app called Hunala, which we just released an update to like literally this week, Hunala, Hunala. We did all of these COVID related stuff. And I thought, well, why don't I write a book as well? Because my desire was to sort of help people to see, and I'll land the plane in a minute. I'm getting there. I don't mean to be so long-winded, but my agenda was to help people to see what was going to happen to us. And so I wrote the book between March and July, and unexpectedly. So that's why, I did this extra book, as you said, within 2 years. It wasn't part of my plan. But here's the thing. Here's the key message in the book. This way that we have all come to live right now, which feels so alien and unnatural. And as you said, none of us have experienced, very few living people have experience with serious pandemics. I mean, some do, but it's not common. This way we've come to live right now feels so alien and unnatural. But what it's very important to realize is that plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us. We think this is crazy, but plagues are in the Bible. They're in Homer, in the Iliad. They're in Shakespeare. They're in Cervantes, in Don Quixote. Plagues are have been a feature of human experience for thousands of years. And so this one is unfolding in a very typical way. And so that's why, that is one of the key, messages in Apollo 0.
Yeah. And as you say, our history is very tied up with plagues, with the bubonic plague you discuss a lot on, smallpox, influenza, which was rather recent.
Measles, syphilis, yellow fever, there are just many, many pathogens that kill us, right? We're all soft on the outside, right? The germs, mostly have been winning.
It's amazing because as you say, we're like in this tug of war between nature and ourselves trying to survive. And at least for me, with this whole new technology, with these new vaccines that we're seeing, it seems that we're getting a rather upper hand in terms of the vaccines. Or
I wouldn't say, here's what I would say about that. I am ordinarily very skeptical about the benefits of modern medicine. In other words, if you look at the health improvements seen in our species over the last 200 years, when we've added, 30 years to life expectancy in rich democracies, which is amazing. Most of those benefits have come from public health interventions and rising wealth. It's not because doctors have invented drugs, by and large. That's not the reason. So usually I'm very skeptical of the benefits of modern medicine. But in this case, I would say these mRNA vaccine platforms are truly extraordinary and will make a very significant dent in our future manner of confronting serious epidemics. But I would not agree with you. Go so far as to say we're gaining the upper hand against these germs because they don't care if they die. They've been around on the planet for hundreds of millions of years more than we have. They can evolve and mutate and evade our defenses. And people have previously had hubris like this before. After the Second World War, during the heyday of the invention of antibiotics, as I discussed in the book, people thought, finally we've conquered infectious diseases. No, We have not. And I don't think we will, but we can do better. And I think we are doing, I do agree with you. These technologies are very helpful.
As you say, these kinds of threats, of statements that people make, just like I did, have been in the history of our species. Like, don't wear a mask. This isn't new, like you say in Apollo's Arrow. And the way our politicians argue that everything is safe, don't worry about it, you're okay. Or, our own healthcare institutions saying masks are not useful, and then change their perspectives on it. And as you say, I agree with you that maybe hubris gets in the way, but in these times of crisis, Professor, where do you think lies the golden the treasure in terms of getting, solving these kinds of issues? Our institutions can help us solve it, or how can we cope with
Well,
this?
I think first of all, as an aside on science, the fact that scientists change their minds is a feature of science, not a bug. That's exactly what we want scientists to do, right? Priests don't change their mind, right? Like priests say, "Oh, this is the received wisdom, and it doesn't, it's invariant." Science is supposed to change its mind when there's new evidence. So, but this is confusing to many people. They don't, they don't understand that. They think that if a scientist changes their mind, it means that they were a fool or they were wrong all along. No, but I don't think scientists have done as good a job as they could have done. I think the scientists, we needed to do better in educating the people to understand what the scientific enterprise is about. To say, here's what I believe today. Here's why I believe it. And here's my degree of confidence in what I'm saying. And then a month from now, we change our mind and say, look, I'm here today to tell you I've changed my mind. Here's why I've changed my mind. Here's the new evidence that's causing me to change my mind. Here's my new updated degree of confidence in what I have to say. And I think if done properly, that kind of communication actually increases the credibility of a scientist rather than decreases it. The people can say, here's a person who, when the facts change, will change his mind. Only a fool doesn't change their mind when the facts change, right? But going back to your original question about the balance between leadership and people, when in a time of crisis, leadership is very important. And in fact, in Blueprint, I talk about some shipwrecks and the Shackleton expedition and other famous cases where a certain kind of leadership and a certain amount of leadership is very important when a group is facing an external threat, especially so. But it's not just about our leaders. I mean, yes, it's true that in the previous administration, I think the president, it was politically inconvenient that there was a pandemic. And I think the president did a number of things that were very wrong. And we know the president was lying. I mean, the president said, don't worry, the pandemic is going away. It's going away. It's going away. We now know he was briefed that it was not going away. He was just lying. There was no evidence to support hydroxychloroquine as treatment. Multiple trials repeatedly were released, one after the other. And yet he refused to abandon that belief. And, injecting yourself with bleach and other kinds of craziness. I mean, these were, falsehoods. Now, falsehoods are always a feature of serious epidemics, and they have been for thousands of years. People have been superstitious, and denial has been a feature, denying that a plague, it's very appealing. When something awful is happening, denial is a very fundamental human defense. So all of that is typical and in some sense understandable, but at the same time, I expect more of the United States of America, and I expect more of our leadership. And I do not expect our leaders to lie to us. Now, some people have argued that it's precisely because our democracy is so good that we come to be led by fools we want. Wow. In other words, if the people wish to be lied to, in the United States, they can elect a leader who will lie to them, and we will get such a leader. Therefore, you see, it's also our responsibility. And I think here, too, the American people did not rise initially to the occasion. I think the leadership should have said, we are facing a serious threat. We have to band together as a people to confront this threat. American factories need to stop what they're doing and start making ventilators and PPE. doctors are going to be taking, nurses are going to be taking extra risks. We lost hundreds of American doctors and nurses lost their lives caring for us. And extra ones lost their lives because some of us didn't wear masks. I mean, on what grounds would you say, I'm going to put doctors and nurses' lives at risk because I don't want to wear a mask? No. Because, of course, when the people who didn't wear masks, for example, got sick, they equally expected to be cared for at our hospitals. And yet their admission to the hospital heightened the burden on our healthcare system. So that was selfish, right? That behavior of not wearing masks, let's say, at that moment, because you're imposing a risk on others. It's not just about yourself. You're spreading the disease to other people, yes, but you're also expecting to be cared for should you get sick. And yet you're not taking even the simplest of precautions, like, wearing a mask, which is, sucks, but it's not so bad compared to other alternatives. So doctors and nurses lost their lives, and other healthcare workers, truckers, as so-called essential workers, and more than 1 million Americans are employed transporting our goods. They had to keep working during the pandemic. Rich people need to pay more taxes. I don't want to hear any rich people complaining about paying taxes. It's a serious threat to our nation. Okay, so everybody had to sacrifice, and school children were out of school, right? So the point is that it was going to be a time of pain. Pandemics for thousands of years. Marcus Aurelius writes about how worse even than the plague was the plague of emotions, of depression that settled over the city. And he talks about how it wasn't just the germ that was killing people. Of course, they didn't know about germs back then. It wasn't just the physical illness. It was the mental illness. And you see that now. It's like grief has settled onto our nation. And plagues are a time of loss. They take our lives, they take our livelihoods, and they take our way of life. And so what effective leadership would have done is prepared the American people for sacrifice. And the American people ideally would have risen to the challenge. And we also, as citizens, would have done more to limit the damage that has been done, and frankly, that will continue to be done by the coronavirus.
Yeah, and you touched on a great deal of points, amazing points. So thank you for just what you said. And one of the things that struck me the most on Apollo's Arrow is your time frame. Right when we began this pandemic, we were told that this would be 2 weeks, only 2 weeks. And then it became 4 weeks, and then a month, and then 6 months, and then all of a sudden we were shut down. And your estimation is that we will be in the end of this, or try to at least be in the end of this by 2024. So up until today to 2024, how will we unfold? What do you see happening?
Yeah. So usually these types of serious pandemics, you can think of them as having 3 phases. There's the first phase, which is the immediate sort of biological and epidemiological phase of the pandemic. That's when the virus is just sweeping through the population. And from the point of view of the virus, you can think that what's happening is this virus is having what is known as an ecological release. It's like an invasive species, like you go to an isolated island and you release rabbits or rats onto the island and they overrun the place, right? Our bodies are the island to the virus, which is the rat. And we have no natural immunity to this virus. It was introduced into our species, and it's going to spread among us and kill at will. That's what it's going to do. And that's the first phase. And it's going to do that until it reaches, in olden days, 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, it would continue to do that until it reached the so-called herd immunity threshold, until enough people were immune to the condition such that the epidemic wasn't growing anymore, and the virus became what's called endemic. It means it's just in the background, like flu is endemic. Just flu kills 60,000 Americans every year in, year out. It just kills some of us. It's just part of the landscape that we face as a species. Coronavirus eventually will become that way too, by the way. Anyway, the first phase of the epidemic is this, when we're being overrun by this wave of virus. And until we reach the herd immunity threshold, either naturally because we're infected and then recover and then have some immunity, or artificially because of vaccination. And that phase is going to continue until the end of 2021. So a couple of years, 2020 and 2021 will be spent with a virus wreaking havoc on the world. I mean, just look what's happening in India right now. So many people are dying. The funeral pyres are burning night and day. Just like at the beginning of the Iliad during Apollo Zero, the funeral pyre, at the beginning, just like at the beginning of the Iliad, when Apollo punished the Greeks in the story, the funeral pyres are burning night and day. So the virus is still going to have a lot of damage it can do to us. But eventually that'll end. And then like a tsunami that has washed ashore and devastated the countryside, the waters recede, but there's all this wreckage now. And that'll be the intermediate phase, beginning sometime in early 2022 or so until the end of 2023, approximately, another couple of years, where we have to clean up the mess, right? I mean, we're going to lose at least, I would say, 750,000 Americans to this virus. I had predicted between 500,000 and 1 million people would die over a year ago. We've already surpassed that. And but probably 5 times as many Americans as die will be disabled by the condition. So I'm not talking about short COVID or long COVID. I'm saying you've recovered from it, but your body is damaged in some way. So we're going to have millions of Americans that are disabled, that need attention. We're going to have millions of children that miss school, millions of people that have lost their jobs, millions of businesses that have gone out of business, millions of Americans who postpone their weddings and other important life events. All of that's going to take time to recover from, the clinical, psychological, social, and economic damage. But then finally, sometime late 2023, late 2024, these are approximate dates and they're not hard and fast. We're going to enter the post-pandemic period. And I think that's going to be a little bit like the roaring 20s of the 21st century compared to the roaring 20s of the 20th century. We're going to have a bit of a party, and that also is typical. Like, after calamity, at the end of the war, when the war is finally over, or the volcano stops erupting, or the pandemic, the plague finally ends, people rejoice, right? People rejoice. They survived and they're free of danger. And so they rejoice. And I think that's a little bit of what's going to happen in the United States. I think people will have been cooped up for quite some time. And I think they're going to seek out social interactions in nightclubs and bars and restaurants and sporting events and political rallies and musical concerts. I think they're going to be spending their money. I think there'll be an economic boom and so on. So I think it's going to be quite a relief when we finally see the other side of it.
All of this brings into the idea that, as you write and you're speaking right now in terms of historical perspective, and as you write in Apollo's Arrow, it brings to the idea that these are all cycles, like human cycles, But I would like to think of our own selves right now, this generation, with the book, the research that you do, the stories that you share with us, and the experts, and these kinds of conversations, that we can change the cycle. Do you think that when we are in the 2024 period, the post-pandemic boom, do you think we'll be able to learn what happened during this pandemic and try to prevent more of them happening, since at least several experts say that climate change can increase the risks of more pandemics to come?
I don't know how much we will learn. First of all, you have to realize that, as I said, plagues are part of the human experience. We have an oral tradition of transmitting this information. Plagues are part of most world religions. They're in our literature. Our ancestors did try to warn us. We did have a transmission of information about what to do about plagues. At the beginning of the Iliad, the story is that, one of the canonical works of Western fiction, of the Western canon, the Iliad, just recounts events that took place 3,000 years ago. The beginning of it is a plague. It starts with a plague, right? And what had happened is the Greeks were laying siege to Troy, and they were periodically going on expeditions and sacking vassal states of Troy. And they sacked a particular city, and they killed all the men, and they enslaved all the women, and they took all the treasure, and they brought it back to the fields around Troy. And a young maiden girl, Chryseis, was given as a slave to Agamemnon, the principal king of the Greeks, and her father survived the massacre, and he was a priest of Apollo, and he comes, the story goes, to the Greek camp to ransom his daughter, and he brings a big treasure, and he goes to Agamemnon's tent, and he falls on his knees, and he begs Agamemnon, release my daughter and take this treasure. And not only does Agamemnon refuse, but he hits the man and he abuses him. He says to him, your daughter will grow old in my house, at my loom, working in my house, in my bed. And the soldiers, the Greek soldiers, don't like this. They're like, take the ransom, give the daughter back to the priest. But Agamemnon does not. And then Agamemnon says, don't let me find you lurking among the ships, hoping to see your daughter. I will kill you if you do. So the priest goes down to the beach and he prays to Apollo. And he says, if I've ever given you sacrifices that you value, hear me now and punish the Greeks. And of course, Apollo hears him right away. And like in many ancient religions, Apollo, the same god, was the god of healing as of disease. That was Apollo too. He puts on his big silver bow of illness. Many ancient religions imagine that illnesses were like invisible arrows flung by the gods, which is not so crazy if you think about it, like invisible germs, come through the air, like airborne transmission, So Apollo flies down from Olympus, and the poem begins, the Iliad begins. He goes that he crouched among the ships, and first he killed the running dogs, then the horses, then the men. 9 days through the army go the arrows of the god, and the funeral pyres burned night and day. Just like in India today, 3,000 years later. And in New York City, we didn't have funeral pyres burning night and day, although the crematoria in New York were burning so much during the epidemic in New York City that they broke. But we had refrigerator trucks, some of which still have bodies in them over a year later. That's so many people die during times of plague that, the funeral pyres burn night and day. And we're seeing that in India again. So here is this, until on the 10th day, Hera, the queen of the gods, took pity on the Greeks, for she saw them perishing. So the point is that we had knowledge about this. Like many of my Jewish friends, when they celebrated Passover in 2020, were like, oh my God, my whole life I was talking about plagues. Now I see it differently, I have a different understanding of it. So there was an oral tradition. We had it in our literature, we had it in our religions, and we had scientists. We had medical historians, we had epidemiologists. I mean, Tony Fauci was writing about respiratory pandemics when I was your age, and so, or younger even. So there is wisdom in our society about these things, and yet as a people, we were not prepared, because there's a different kind of collective memory. And that's the collective memory, not of stories or of science. That's the collective memory of our lived experience. Did you survive it yourself? And the analogy I give here is hurricanes. When hurricanes strike Florida, people know which ones to take seriously, and they know what to do because they've had that experience, and everyone around them has had that experience. So big hurricanes come every 10 years or so. It's in living memory. The person on the street knows, oh my God, there's a serious hurricane coming. I remember what happened the last 3 of them. I'm going to, take action, okay? Serious pandemics come every 50 or 100 years. So they're outside of our living memory, and so we forget. So in answer to your question, whether we will learn, it depends on whether, in fact, as you suggested, which I think is true, are the pandemics coming more frequently? And there is some evidence that that's true, and therefore it's likely that you will have another serious pandemic that you confront in your lifetime, and you will think differently about it when it happens.
I do hope that our lived memory can help us overcome it if it comes. And one of the tools that we have, as you mentioned, to prevent this from getting worse or very, very bad, is science. And I always wanted to ask you this since the book I read, Blueprint, it's not your first one, I think it's your third one. I wanted to ask you on this crisis that I think it's happening around science, that, for example, many of the research that's happening is not being replicated, or at least that's what we're hearing. So what can we do, younger generations, to try not to say this is science, and you at least get a better grasp of how to do the scientific method. And do you think we're living in a crisis in terms of our scientific tools?
I think it's very interesting that you bring up the so-called replication crisis. For your listeners, what Alex is alluding to is the fact that many findings, especially in the social sciences, but not only in the social sciences, fail to replicate. So scientist does an experiment, publishes the results, maybe even uses the correct methods. Then another scientist comes and tries to reproduce the results and doesn't find the same results about some behavior, let's say, or something. But it's not only in the social and behavioral sciences. We also find it in medicine, for example. Many drugs, the scientists do a randomized controlled trial of a drug. They say this drug works to lower cholesterol or treat cancer or whatever. And then some other scientist comes along and does the same experiment, and oops, the drug doesn't work as it did in the first trial. That's a problem. Even in physics, there are problems in replication. So there was a famous experiment called the BICEP2 experiment about background microwave radiation, which there was a little glitch, and the scientists came back and redid the measurement, and oops, it wasn't true. So many branches of the sciences are having a kind of identity crisis right now about how to make sure increase confidence in results that we believe. But I would say that's in fact exactly how science is supposed to work. And so it is working that way. In other words, the replication crisis is not a bug, it's a feature. It is what science is supposed, it's self-correcting. Scientists are improving their methods to reduce the likelihood of false positive results, and are talking among themselves about how to shore up scientific procedures to avoid the failure to reproduce results. So I don't see it. I'm not pessimistic about it. In other words, like I agree. You're right to point out that there is, and incidentally, just to be clear, these problems we're talking about are not fraud or falsehoods. In other words, we're talking about scientists who are working in earnest, faithfully, accurately reporting what they observe and see and are doing, not scientists who fabricate data, which is another problem, which also happens and always did happen. But that's a tiny fraction of the problem. We have a more general problem, which is that many of the results that are reported in the scientific literature can't be reproduced. But the mere fact that people are trying to reproduce them is a strength, not a weakness. I mean, that's how we come to be more certain about things.
Yeah, I like that perspective. I really do. But to that point, or trying to double down, what if public policy gets done in terms of something that isn't a research that it's not very very strong, very.
Yeah. So that problem is, what if we base public policy on weak science or false science, right? Yeah, I mean, that I'm sure that happens, where we think something is true and we recommend that a drug be used. For example, a randomized controlled trial is done. We think this is an effective drug. We recommend its widespread use. And then as time goes by, we realize actually, no, the drug is not helpful. And in fact, we're exposing people to risk for no benefit. We're harming people by this drug. And so we've implemented a policy based on an inaccurate understanding of the world. So you're right. I mean, that can happen, and that's awful.
But it's, as you say, I think that, to get to your point, itself, we can fix it. If we see that it doesn't work, at least, reading Blueprint and hearing you, I've learned to give people the benefit of the doubt. We're a good society. We try to fix things.
That's another whole, topic. I mean, the argument in Blueprint is that, I guess that the intellectual stance of the book is that for too long, scientists and the person on the street have been obsessed with the dark side of human nature, right? Our capacity for violence and hatred and cruelty and lying. But the bright side has been denied the attention it deserves, because equally we are a species that is capable of wonderful qualities like love and friendship and cooperation and teaching. We teach each other things. This is very rare in the other animals. you and I are taking it for granted that we teach each other stuff, but this is not, other animals don't teach each other things. So all these wonderful qualities that we have, and I would argue that these good qualities outweigh the bad qualities. That the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. That's why we live socially to begin with, and therefore, furthermore, that natural selection has shaped these qualities. So, in other words, the idea is that our evolution has shaped not just the structure and function of our bodies. Of course, our evolution has done that, but our evolution has also shaped the structure and function of our minds, and hence our behaviors. And finally, even that our evolution has shaped the structure and function of our societies. The kind of social order that we make has been shaped by natural selection. So, for example, many animals have sex with each other. They reproduce by sexual reproduction. They mate. We, of course, mate too, but we do something else. We form long-term, non-reproductive unions to other members of our species. Namely, we have friends. That's very weird. Why do we do that? Other animals don't have friends. It's very rare in the animal kingdom. We do it. Certain other primates do it. Whales do it. Certain whale species, and elephants have friends. And this is forming a long-term union with an unrelated individual. Of course, in certain other animals like horses and dogs and certain other species in other orders live in groups, of course, but often those groups are all cousins. They're all related. So we form friendships with unrelated individuals. This is rare, and natural selection played a role in endowing us with this amazing capacity of friendship, which is wonderful, actually, if you think about it, and incidentally lies at the core of many of our ways of organizing ourselves. Lies at the core of social order.
Yeah, and I really love that you touched on love, because that's the exact part, I think it was chapter 6 in Blueprint when you talk about love, and it was that chapter that it made me laugh, scream, and cry, because there's this research that you mentioned on how we use our couples in terms of their odor, so you touched on the political preferences, and to give my listeners the context, they did a research on, they chose, I think it was 120 people, and they were asked to smell certain wardrobes, I think, from people who, I think they were told to do a test on their political preferences, so you had the whole spectrum, and these individuals had to choose the best perfumes. They didn't know they were sweat from from other people, and I remember that this blew my mind. People chose their favorite perfumes in terms of their political alignments, and the very funny part is, I had to stop the car because I was in the Audible. I was listening to you, and I couldn't believe someone said that this is the best perfume I've ever listened. And the similarities of the political preferences were just amazing. And then another person told the researchers that this should be thrown to the garbage. And it was the exact opposite of their political preferences. So, why did I cry? Because it made me think a lot of my free will and who will I love in the future. Why did I laugh? Because I feel that I have free will. And why did I scream? Because it was so amazing how this evolutionary blueprint that we have can have such an impact in the way we are and the way we unfold as human beings. So, trying to wrap up, Professor Christakis, I have an immense amount of questions for you, but your research, your whole 4 books, and the things that you've witnessed in your whole career, do you think we have free will or no?
So yes, I do think we have free will. I mean, this is an ancient, the deterministic, theory of the universe. Can we choose or can we not choose freely? I think we have a free will within constraints. So like even the ideas that you mentioned about how we choose our friends based on the way evolution has shaped us, for instance, yes, that plays a role, but it's not deterministic. I mean, the main thing that determines who you're friends with, there is a role of biology for sure, But the main thing is, where did you go to school? What school did your parents pick to send you? That's not something you chose. They chose to put you in the school, and that's where you met the people that you might befriend. Or, how tolerant are you of people with different political beliefs, for instance? That's something you might develop in yourself. Or, what kind of efforts do you make? Or what kind of personality do you have, which is only partly related to your genes, and so on. So there are many factors that are vastly more important than these biological factors that affect who you pick as friends and how friendly you are. So yes. On the other hand, it's also true that you're not fully free. Many of the things that you choose to do, you're choosing to do because of the environment around you, the social environment around you. One of my favorite sayings about this was a social commentator by the name of Tim, I think was his first name, Hoffer. He was a longshoreman and a social critic. And he said, he observed the irony that when people are free to do whatever they want, they generally copy each other. In other words, most of the constraint on our free will is that you think you're making a free choice to do X or Y, but actually you're just doing it because everyone else is doing it. And it really takes a strong person to truly pick on their own what's the right course of action, or what is it that they really want for themselves, and to avoid fads and fashions and go against the grain. This is not an easy thing to do. Anyway, I do not reject the role of free will. I absolutely think we have free will, but under constraints, I guess is the way I would put it.
Professor, I really do hope we have another opportunity in the future to talk, because your research has done a great impact on the way I see things. And you right now, your last intervention saying that it takes a strong person to choose freely, in a sense. I believe that with sharing one's wisdom, such as what you've done with us, makes one be able to choose more freely, in a sense. So I appreciate it.
I would agree with that, actually. Like, to cultivate in oneself the discipline of education, it frees the mind, right? All great journeys begin in the mind. And I think that is exactly right. I think cultivating in yourself the self-discipline to study, learn, be open-minded is absolutely essential to truly having free will. Otherwise, you're just following dogma. Anyway, Alex, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm sure we'll continue this another time.
I hope so. Take care.
Thank you.